Hello everyone, today I wanted to talk about combining pressure and disruption using the Mana Crypt Mox Strip Mine spread in Canadian Highlander. I think that there's not a lot of talk about Canadian Highlander theory. There's a lot of talk about what decks do you bring, card choices, that sort of thing, but not so much about broad overall, um, theory about the format. So I wanted to make this video. I plan to do more of these in the future, and since I just spent the last month playing various builds with this point spread, I wanted to I kind of wanted to share my thoughts about it and uh, give sort of a deck building template for people to experiment on their own. So the agenda for this presentation is I'm going to talk about how the Crypt Mox Trip spread differs from other similar fast mana spreads you might see in decks like this. Most of these decks that I'm going to be talking about are going to be one or two color decks, or what I call a 2.5 color deck, and I'll explain more about that later on. There's also this concept that I want to go over, which is your cards that you include in these types of decks can range along a scale of aggressive versus disruptive. They can either be purely aggressive, a mixture of aggressive and disruptive, or purely disruptive. And I think because of the fast mana that you get from this type of build, it's okay to have cards that aren't purely aggressive. You're allowed to have cards that only disrupt your opponent. Then I want to talk about what having a lot of soul mana does to your deck building and your mana base, and what the color constraints are, and sort of the differences between green and non-green decks using this point spread. After that, I'm going to go over some curve considerations and uh, why you should include mana sinks and card advantage into your deck, and what those kind of cards would look like. What kind of cards you want to include in your deck to be able to take advantage of having lots of mana. Then I'm going to go over some general metrics that I've come up with. They're not very hard metrics, but they should give a broad sort of deck building guideline for people who want to try out this spread. And then finally, I'm going to go over 4 decks that I've played over the last month as sort of case studies in using this point spread. What I did right, what I did wrong, how they could be improved, and just to give some inspiration for how versatile this point spread is. So let's talk about different point spreads. When you're talking about 1 to 2 color decks that are proactive, there's generally what I would consider 3 main point spreads. There's the so-called medium spread, which is where decks like medium red and medium green get their names, and this is the Mana Crypt, Sol Ring, Mana Vault spread. The benefits of playing the medium spread is that it's extremely explosive, because all your pointed cards give you tons of mana, and you can accelerate out some really powerful 4 and 5 drops. The disadvantages is that you have to be pretty pip light, because you're playing, a lot of soul mana, and your pointed cards aren't really helping you fix at all. They're not giving you colored mana, they're just giving you raw bursts of speed. You can be kind of clunky, because if you don't draw your fast mana, you have a bunch of 4s and 5s in your deck, which are hard to cast quickly, and you usually have to be monocolor. You might see some initiative decks, 3-color, sometimes even 4-color initiative decks that are using this spread. That's because those decks have really bad mana, but they're hoping to just land an initiative threat that snowballs out of the game that it doesn't matter. But the medium spread is usually restricted to monocolor decks. Then on sort of the other side of the spectrum is what I call the stable fast mana spread, which is Double Mox Sol Ring. And the nice thing about the Double Mox Sol Ring spread is that it's very balanced. It's good at casting pretty much everything. You can play a lot more pip dense stuff, because you have Moxen that are, giving you actual colors, and you're usually focused on 3 and 4 drops. Because Mox and, Moxen on turn 1 jump you from 1 to 2, so you can play turn 2, 3 drop. Sol Ring on turn 1 drop jumps you from 1 to 3, but you've already used 1, so you usually don't get to play a 3 drop on turn 1, but you can play a 4 drop on turn 2. It's the issue with this spread is it's not that it's not a good spread, it's that it's less explosive. Um, it's very stable. Your points aren't going to hurt you. Like Mana Vault and Mana Crypt can just, deal you a lot of damage and lose you the game. But it's less explosive. And it's usually restricted to 2-color decks. I suppose you could play it in 3-color decks, but most 3-color decks, once you get past a certain point, are just more interested in triple mocks if they want stable mana. This is the sort of point spread that you'll usually see in something like Gruul Monsters, for example. Sort of in between these 2 point spreads, the medium spread and the stable fast mana spread, is the spread I want to talk about today, which I'm calling the aggro disruptive spread. And that's the Crypt Mox strip spread. The benefits that you get are that you're explosive, because Mana Crypt is an extremely powerful card in your opening hand. Lets you play 3 drops on turn 1, possibly even 4 drops on turn 1 with, Crypt plus any other acceleration. You can play 4 drops on turn 2. You get a little bit of mana stability with the Mox, but what you really get that's sort of unique to the spread is that you get Strip Minus Disruption. And the thing about Canadian Highlander decks is that they're almost all built on extremely greedy mana bases. And having a greedy mana base is usually a good thing, because you'd rather have slight mana troubles but have better high roll potential than to be flooding out every game. However, what this means is that using Strip Mine, even as just a second wasteland, is a really good way of making your opponent's game plan stumble. If your opponent mulligans to 5, they're usually not keeping very many hands that have a lot of lands in them, so having more land destruction is a way to just make the game not playable for your opponent. Even on 7s, if your opponent keeps, a 2-lander with a bunch of cantrips, and you wasteland or strip mine them, then there's a lot more pressure on their cantrips to find more lands. One thing that I like about this spread is that it's very versatile. As far as I can tell, you can fit it into almost any 2-color shell. And you can play anything from 1 to what I call 2.5 color, which I'll talk about when I talk about color constraints. But the nice thing about this spread, again, is it differentiates itself by having the explosive power of Mana Crypt with the disruptive power of Strip Mine, and really the Mox is just sort of additional fast mana. So, let's move on to some card choices. There's what I would consider, beyond just playing your normal suite of, you have some removal, you have some generic cards that do things that you need them to do, and besides your accelerants and all that stuff, you have a suite of threats in these decks. And these decks are, I think, are very creature heavy. They're probably 30 plus creatures most of the time. And your threats, though, can also be non-creatures, and you can sort of look at them on a sort of sliding scale of aggressive to disruptive and in between. On the aggressive side, you have creatures like Bloated Contaminator, Furnace Punisher, White Plume Adventurer. These creatures are the most efficient for their mana cost. They have the best keywords for evasion. They deal the most damage. Their entire purpose is to just put the pressure on your opponent and really be your main sort of hammers for winning the game. You can lower the aggression, though, and play creatures that are more disruptive with weaker stat lines. So Thalia Heretic Cathar is pretty good because it has first strike, but it is a 3/2, so it dies to shock. Opposition Agent dies to shock. It's a 3/2. It doesn't have any keywords really that are super relevant. Obviously, Flash is quite good, but it doesn't have any combat keywords. Magus of the Moon's a 2/2. Doesn't have any combat keywords. These are all creatures that, if you were just going for pure speed, you would not include, except, again, maybe Thalia and Op Agent. It's a little hard to say because some of these are generic cards that are really good. But even things like Leonin Arbiter, Little Thalia, Orcish Bowmasters, these cards have less raw speed, but their entire purpose is to make your opponent stumble. A Magus of the Moon doesn't look so good, except when it comes out on turn 1 on a Mana Crypt and your opponent doesn't have any lands that tap for mana that they care about. So you have aggressive creatures, you have disruptive creatures, so how can you get more disruptive? Well, this is where we start to move towards non-creature effects, and I call these game-altering pieces. And you usually won't see these in most decks because people are often told when they're coming into this format, and it's sort of a common knowledge that you don't play cards that are narrow in effect, because they might be dead in certain matchups, and we don't have sideboards. It's a 100-card singleton. But I have found that cards like Thorn of Amethyst, Mind Twist, Winter Orb, these cards which are somewhat situational, are really good when they're powered out by fast mana. And you can typically break the symmetry on them so that it makes your opponent stumble much more than you do, which clears the way for your aggressive creatures to sweep up the game and just kill your opponent. These non-altering game-altering pieces are typically non-creature effects, and you do have to be careful with how many you include in them because you don't want to lower the speed of your deck too much, but they can be really potent for making your opponent's stays miserable. Honestly, this is Canadian Highlander. We're not in the business of trying to make our opponents have a fun time. So that was sort of the aggression versus disruption. Next, let's talk about colors. So, sort of the purpose of playing Mana Crypt and Soul Mana in general is that you want to accelerate into powerful 3-drops most of the time. This usually means that you're going to have Strip Mine and Mana Crypt are part of your point spread. You're going to automatically have those. Wasteland is another disruptive piece. You're always going to have that. You're almost certainly going to have Ancient Tomb, because if you didn't have Ancient Tomb, you probably shouldn't be playing Mana Crypt. This means you already have 4 colorless sources in your deck. A lot of times you're going to want to spread to City of Traders as a 5th colorless source, because it's basically another Ancient Tomb that, is temporary. On top of that, you might want to get Urza Saga in here, because Urza Saga is really good against blue decks. It's a good way to sink mana in. It's a good thing to sink mana into, and also it conveniently tutors up things like Mana Crypt when it's done. The thing is that once you're here at 6 sources, and sometimes you might even want to be crazy and go to Crystal Vein, go to 7 sources, you've got a lot of colorless sources in a deck that's, 1 or 2 color. This means that it's really hard in these types of decks to cast a lot of cards that have double pips. Obviously, you can cast cards with double pips, and you should include some cards with double pips because they are very powerful, but you have to be careful about what ones you want to choose. So, for example, if you're in a black-red deck, you don't want to be playing Dreadbore, because Dreadbore, while being a strong card, is often interchangeable with a lot of other removal spells. If you're going to play a double pip spell, you want something like Dauthi Voidwalker, or you might even want something like Florian, Voldaren Scion. You want these cards that are really high impact, and generally you want your double pip cards to be threats. You might even want like Hymn to Turok, which is double black. Those cards are a lot better and a lot less replaceable than something like Dreadbore, Molten Collapse, that sort of thing. When you have so many colorless sources in your deck, your ability to double spell, even with very pip-light cards, even with cards with only a single pip, your ability to double spell is gated often not by the raw amount of mana you have, but by the amount of colored sources that you have. And so really what this means is that adding all these colorless sources is kind of like adding a third color to your deck, a colorless color to your deck. It's obviously not so far as to say it's 100% like a third color, but I think that it really puts a large strain on the mana bases of these Crypt, Mox, Strip Spread decks. And I think one thing that is not immediately obvious is that these 2-color decks, and obviously the one color decks their mana is fine because it's a 1-color deck. But these 2-color decks, you also want to be running a lot of basics. And that might seem counterintuitive because if my ability to cast spells is gated by my colored sources, you might think you want colored sources that can tap for multiple colors. But what actually happens is that when you play a deck that has a lot of soul mana in it, your ability to lose access to your colored sources by getting wastelanded or otherwise disrupted is a lot higher. And so you want to be able to play on a lot of basics if possible, because this insulates you against things like Blood Moon, Price of Progress, even because Crypt and Ancient Tomb are hurting you. Some people play back to basics. These are things that are not common, but they do show up, and it also insulates you against Wasteland, which is in almost every deck. You also might want to take advantage of things like your own Blood Moon, your own Price of Progress, your own Magnus of the Moon. So being able to have a lot of basics is a very powerful thing, and usually is not worth splashing a third color. The exception to this rule is when you're playing green decks. When you're playing green decks, you get to sort of cheat because you get to play a number of mana dorks that count as part of your mana base that give you fixing. Things like Birds of Paradise, Ignoble and Noble Hierarchs, Deathrite Shaman. These ones are very good at splashing for anything. Almost anything. Obviously, Ignoble Hierarch's not splashing for white or anything. But these let you branch out a little bit more because they act as part of your mana base without altering your basic count. Things like Delighted Halfling can let you splash Legends really easily. In these green decks, you have so much mana, I often like using Biophagus as my only 2-drop mana dork, because it's a rainbow dork, and it makes your threats that are already pretty big even bigger, so you win almost all mid-range wars. However, even with this many mana dorks, you have to be pretty conservative on splashing a third color. And I think that the highest amount of cards I would recommend splashing is 5 cards in a third color. And generally speaking, I would recommend splashing higher on the curve and for threats, not for answers. So it's better to splash, for example, if you're in a green-white deck, it's better to splash for Grist and Opposition Agent than it is to splash for Assassin's Trophy and Abrupt Decay. That's just an example. So there's a little bit of a difference between green and non-green. Also, you're going to notice in the next section, I'm going to be talking about a lot of different cards, and I didn't mention any blue cards. I think that you can build a blue deck that uses this principle, but I haven't figured out how to do so. That's not to say it can't be done. It's just that blue is naturally more reactive, and naturally wants to string together a lot of things like cantrips, or play double blue spells like Counterspell. And so it's more difficult to incorporate soul mana into that kind of a game plan. That's not to say it can't be done, and I actually recommend people experiment with it to see if they can find a shell that works for them. Alright, moving on to talking about curve considerations and how to build in mana sinks and card advantage. So the thing about this aggro-disruptive style deck with the Crypt Mox Strip spread is that you have a lot of mana. But that doesn't mean that you have a lot of mana that's persistent, or that you want to have so much mana that you're consistently hitting 5 or 6 mana. You want to be hitting your 3 to 4 mana, and if you get to 5 or 6 mana, you want to be playing multiple 3 drops, multiple 2s and 3s. You don't want to be necessarily going all the way up to 5 drops or 6 drops. So your curve actually focuses mostly on 3s and 4s. In green decks, you'll notice you'll have a lot more 1-drops. That's because you'll have a lot of mana dorks. You might have things like Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth, possibly even things like Fast Bond. So you'll have a lot of 1-drops. And the main purpose of that is that it improves your consistency for getting to your turn 2 3-drop, or your turn 2 4-drop. So you tend to skip the 2-drop slot a bit in the green decks, and focus more on 3s and 4s, and you might play a few 5s. Most 5s are really unnecessary in Canadian Highlander. Most of the time when a 5-drop would win a game, a 4-drop would win a game, 2 3-drops would win a game. The 5-drops are usually very win more, and sometimes they can be stuck in your hand. Even though these are decks that have a lot of mana in them, you don't necessarily always hit 5 mana on turn 5. You might hit 3 mana or 4 mana on turn 2, and then not draw any more mana sources for the next 6 turns. Also, most of these decks are looking to end the game on like turn 4 or 5 or so, with the ability to grind, but the main game plan is not to go to turn 8, turn 12, or whatever. The main game plan is to end the game quickly. For non-green decks, it's a lot harder to get to your early 3s and 4s, so you're going to have more 2-drops to bridge the gap. That's okay, because if you've got something like, Mountain, Ancient Tomb, you can play 2 1-in-a-red cards. You can still use your soul mana effectively by playing cards that are not very pip dense. That being said, you have a lot of mana in these decks, and the worst thing that can happen is you have a lot of mana and nothing to do with it. These decks really thrive by always making use of as much mana as they can every single turn. So for that end, you kind of want some mana sinks. So I've built a few different categories. There's stuff like creatures that have mana sinks, things like Hazoret, Rampaging Raptor, Hexdrinker. These let you convert excess mana into more damage or into growing your creature. And it's a way to make cards scale. Even though obviously Hazoret and Rampaging Raptor are both 4-drops, it means that when you empty your hand, you have things to do with your mana. Hexdrinker turns from a 1-drop into, over time, basically an 8-drop or a 9-drop. Other things you can do is you can include the Adventures in Forgotten Realms manlands, such as Den of the Bugbear and Hive of the Eye Tyrant. I like these over any of the tapped manlands that tap for 2 colors because these decks really value going fast and having your mana come in untapped early. So having tapped lands is really bad. Really disrupts that plan. And I like it over stuff like Mishra's Foundry, is it? Whatever. The Mishra's Workshop. No, not Workshop. Whatever. The 1 mana 1, or the one that turns into a 2/2 for 1. Colorless manlands put even more of a strain on a mana base and are usually not big enough to be that impactful, in my opinion. And the Adventures in Forgotten Realms manlands really help they fit that niche of untapped when it needs to be untapped, and then late game being good mana sinks. Cards like the Lord of the Rings Land Cyclers or Timeless Dragon are also ways to build mana sinks into your deck because they allow you to turn colorless mana into colored sources, which again is one of the gates for double spelling. But also late game, if you happen to have a lot of mana on you, you can just cast them. They're reasonable creatures to cast. I don't count these as far as curve consideration goes. I don't count the land cyclers as part of your 5 or 6 drops that you're allowed to have. You can play a black-red deck that has Scroll of Cosmic Doom in it, and it's fine, in my opinion, because most of the time it's 1. But in a late game, or if you have a reanimate, it's a threat that you can use. Other cards that can be used are equipment. Equipment is a good way of putting mana sinks into the deck. Shadow Spear is really good at breaking apart mid-range matchups. It gets through board stalls really, really well. It also helps offset things like the life loss from Mana Crypt or Ancient Tomb, which lets you keep casting more spells and using your life total as a resource. Skull Clamp lets you, especially in green decks, turn your mana dorks, which are no longer needed late game, into more cards, which is just more gas for you to use. You can even fit things like Cauldra in here. Even though Cauldra is technically a 7-drop, usually you're not playing it without Stoneforge Mystic. Conveniently, this Crypt Mock Strip Spread is also what Death and Taxes usually uses. So they use some of these principles themselves with things like Cauldra, which are not meant to be spent 7 mana on. You're not meant to spend 7 mana on Cauldra, but sometimes you will. Other things you can do include things like Horizon Lands, Sunbaked Canyon, Nurturing Peatland, Horizon Canopy, because these things tap for multiple mana. They come in untapped, and they're ways to turn a lot of excess mana late game into more cards. I'm talking about all these things with altering your land base, so you have to be a little bit careful because, like I said, you still want to have a lot of basics to keep your stability, but you are able to have some flood prevention by playing utility lands like this. Another category is literally just pure card draw. Things like Ren's Resolve, Night's Whisper. These are cards that just draw you more cards. And I generally like the ones that are 2 CMC because they're really easy to string together with other spells. They fit into the curve really nicely. They actually just overperform. They really smooth out decks. They really smooth out these types of decks in a way that's very helpful because they're not typically running cantrips like a blue deck would. Another way that you could put mana sinks and card advantage into your deck are things like Sentinel of the Nameless City, Tireless Tracker, Lelia. These are cards that just either create game objects that you can sink mana into that draw you cards, or draw you cards themselves. But the important thing about playing creatures that do this is that these creatures are reasonable on their own. Sentinel of the Nameless City is a 3/4 vigilance, and grows whenever you explore with it and don't hit lands. That's a pretty powerful stat line. Tireless Tracker is a little bit weaker. It's a 3/2, but every time you crack one of those clues, it grows. Lelia grows itself whenever it attacks. It also grows with things like Ren's Resolve, Light of the Stage. all that kind of stuff. These cards are already good enough threats on their own, while also providing you with places to put mana, places to get more cards. And then sort of the last category are the Evoke Elementals from MH2. Most of the time, these cards are 0 mana, so they don't count as part of your 5-drop slot. But if you've got, 5 mana late game, hard casting them is usually extremely powerful. It's usually a huge 2 or 3 for 1, and is really powerful. All I'm trying to say is that you want to focus on your 3s and 4s, because those are your bread and butter. Those are the things that are going to win you the most games. But you also have a lot of mana in the deck, so you want to have places to put that mana. And so this is just something to keep in mind when building decks using the Crypt Mox Strip Spread. You want to be able to include ways to keep velocity and to always be spending mana every turn of the game. Alright, now that we've covered sort of curve considerations and stuff, I'm just going to go over some general metrics. These are not really hard counts, but these are things that I have found in my brewing and testing to be, to be useful. You don't have to take these as gospel. You don't have to take these as hard facts if you were to build your own versions of these decks, but I think that they're a good starting point. For non-green decks, you want 40 to 45 mana sources that cost 1 or less. This includes Lotus Petal, Chromox, I'd count Mox Diamond, Mana Crypt, your Mox that you're already playing as part of your points. This counts Simian Spirit Guide, this counts Deathrite Shaman, this counts Dark Ritual, this counts Ragavan. If it produces mana and it's 1 or less, it counts as a mana source. You want at least 34 lands. And part of this, in my opinion, is just general stability. You're already playing a lot of colorless lands, so your number of colored sources is already kind of low in terms of your mana base. And I do find that Mox Diamond is usually pretty useful in these types of decks. And playing the Mox Diamond with a lower than 34 land count is dubious at best in terms of how the math works out for making sure that it's actually a useful mana source. Usually 2 to 5 of those lands will produce 2+ mana. It's pretty easy to get 2. That's just Ancient Tomb and City of Traders, but sometimes you might want Crystal Vein. You might want some depletion lands. Usually you want at least two lands that produce more than 2 mana. I think that you want at least 30 creatures in these non-green decks. This is because you really want to make sure that you always have pressure and you always have stuff that can, at the very least, turn sideways. If you have too many removal spells, too many card draw spells that are not creatures, too many of those game-altering pieces that I talked about before that are not creatures, you can have a lot of draws that look anemic and don't actually effectively pressure your opponent's life totals, and that's just not really acceptable for a proactive deck that this point spread really caters towards. So some things to look at: the 2-drops, 16 to 20, 3-drops, 13 to 22. You want to have a lot more 3-drops, I think, in your non-green decks than 4-drops, because it's a lot easier to get to 3 mana on turn 2 or turn 3 than it is to get to 4 mana on turn 2 or turn 3. And it's just easier once you're at like the 5 or 6 mana points, a lot easier to double spell with 3-drops than it is to double spell with 4-drops. I think you can have probably up to like 6-ish 4-drops. I would hesitate. One thing that I think people will often do is just throw initiative creatures in as their 4-drops. I would caution on that. You can play, obviously, the best ones. The best initiative creatures are really good, but there's a lot of danger to putting in, to accelerating out an initiative creature and then losing the initiative. And in these decks, usually don't have enough removal to jockey back and forth. They're just going to hope to go over with more creatures, and sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. 5-drops, I think you should have 0 5-drops in non-green decks. I know people really like their Chaos Defilers or their Glory Bringers or whatever. And you can play Fury. Fury is not a 5-drop in my opinion. It's a 0-drop. But I think that you're going to lose more games with a 5-drop in hand that you can't cast than you are by playing that 5-drop. Most of the time that a 5-drop can do, most situations where a 5-drop will do the job, a 4-drop will also do the job. As far as double pipped spells, this includes things that are two of the same color or two of different colors. I think that you should go from 6 to maybe 12 of them maximum, because again, you're really gated by colored sources, and if you've got too many double pipped spells, it really hampers the potency that your soul mana is giving you. You know, your soul mana is meant to give you this explosive speed, and if you can't cast your spells because they're all double pipped, why are you using soul mana in the first place? I think that also you should restrict yourself to up to 2 double pipped cards that are 2 pips of the secondary color. So, for example, if you were black-red and your base color was black, you could play Fiery Confluence and Territorial Hellkite as some of your double pipped cards. But you shouldn't be playing Fiery Confluence, Territorial Hellkite, Ash Zealot, Eidolon of the Great Revel, all those things. You should limit yourself to at most 2 of them, because you really want to be proactively fetching for your primary color and operating on 1, maybe 2 sources of your secondary color. And again, 8 basics I think is a good minimum for these types of decks in order to keep mana stability and play around your own hate effects like Blood Moon, Price of Progress, etc. For green decks, you're naturally going to have more mana sources that cost 1 or less because of all the mana dorks. Mana dorks count as part of your mana base according to this definition. And something I really want to emphasize is that although these decks are almost half mana, a green deck 44 to 50 mana sources, including the mana dorks, that's almost, that's 50% mana, which is a lot more than something like red deck wins, which is playing like 29 lands or 20 or 30 lands with, Lotus plus Mox Ruby. Even though you're playing a lot of mana sources, you're still really only focused on 3 and 4 drops. You're not trying to go up super high into the 5s and 6s. You instead use your excess mana in those mana sinks that we talked about in the previous section. So again, 34 lands minimum. Usually you might have a Gaia's Cradle in these types of decks, so that's another land that produces a lot more mana. I think you want at least 33 creatures. Probably you might even want 35 creatures, because your mana dorks count as creatures, but they really are not very good at applying pressure. And if you have most of your creatures end up being mana dorks and not a lot of payoffs, then your deck is again kind of slow and sluggish. So green decks get to skip the 2 drops a little bit compared to the non-green decks. They get to play similar amount of 3 drops. They get to play more 4 drops. It's just the privilege of having a lot more acceleration. And I think in green decks you can justify like 2 to 3 5 drops. I would still keep most of my 5 drops as things that are, not really 5 drops, things like the Generous Ents or the Timeless Dragons of the world. But having something like a Thrun Breaker of Silence is really strong against stuff like blue. Your mana dorks, you get to be a little bit more greedy with your double pips, and you get to play a 3rd splash color, up to 5 cards. In my opinion, if you go above 5 cards, you probably should not be on this sort of point spread. You should probably be looking at more Moxen, or just buffing down and having a much greedier mana base, and not focusing so much on soul mana. I think you should have a minimum of 8 basics, and this is maybe a little controversial. I think you should have 0 of the splash color. This is because when you have so few cards in your 3rd splash color, you don't really want to be drawing the basic of the splash color, because it acts as a colorless land for all of your normal spells that are in your primary 2 colors. And you can usually operate around things like Blood Moons for your splash colors because you have stuff like mana dorks. Mana dorks really fix a lot of the mana stability issues. So those are some general metrics. Let's talk about, let's go into the case studies. So my first case study is a deck called Medium Red. I'm not the creator of this deck. A lot of people played this deck before me, but I have played this deck for several months, so I would consider this deck to be quite refined compared to some of my other creations. Medium Red is basically what if you took RDW and you replaced all the shocks with 3 drops so that you could use soul mana. You're between Medium Red and RDW, hence Medium Red. So, this is the curve. You might have seen this earlier. This was the non-green curve. I've got 34 lands plus 5 mana-producing artifacts, so that's 39 sources. Plus, I have Simian Spirit Guide, So I have 40 sources in this deck that is theoretically just a pure aggro deck. And this deck is really just a pure aggro deck. You know, I have almost no utility lands except for a couple mana sinks like Den of the Bugbear, Ragnarok Ruins, Sokenzon. I've got my Disruption with Strip Mine and Wasteland. And really the only disruptive pieces are the Blood Moon, the Magus of the Moon, and the Avalanche Riders that I have. And you could build a deck, you could build a medium red version that doesn't play Blood Moon, and doesn't play Magus of the Moon, and doesn't play Avalanche Riders, and those are all good. The deck's main core game plan is to play aggressive threats, kill the opponent quickly with burn spells and powerful creatures. But in keeping with the idea of I want to incorporate disruption into my proactive game plan, the Magus of the Moon and the Blood Moon are easy enough splashes to be worth considering. Avalanche Riders is a little bit less. I think you could definitely build this deck without Avalanche Riders and just play another hasty 4-drop in there, but I will tell you that playing a Stone Rain attached to a 2/2 haste body that can be flung by Broadside Bombardiers or turned into a 4/1 by Gut actually is a lot better than it looks. So I don't think that there's much that can be said about this deck. This deck is pretty well positioned. I've won multiple weeklies with this, and really you can change up a lot of threats. You can play more haste threats instead of more evasive threats or whatever, but the main composition of the deck is the same. It even has some card advantage with Reckless Impulse, Ren's Resolve, and Light Up the Stage. Just a way to keep the cards flowing. And this is really like a pure aggressive deck. When I was talking about the pure aggressive versus disruptive creatures versus the game objects, this one is almost all the way on the side of pure aggression. So that was medium red. The next 3 decks are all going to be like 2.5 color decks. So the next deck that I'm going to talk about is Black-Red Monsters. Now, part of this is because I love Rakdos as a combination. I think Rakdos is a lot better than people give it credit for. And I think the best thing you can do with Rakdos is be very proactive, because you get a lot of strong threats with really disruptive hand attack. In an effort to differentiate itself from just playing medium red, because it's kind of hard to improve upon mono red by adding a second color to it, this deck is base black. It's 49% black. I mean, it's 40% red, but it's base black with secondary red. And what this deck has, it's got 35 lands in it. The 5 artifacts, Dark Ritual, so that's 41 already. Spirit Guide, 42, Deathrite, and Ragavan. So it's got 44 quote-unquote mana sources. And the purpose of this deck is to be really disruptive with cards like Sinkhole, Mind Twist, Hymn to Chorak, Wrench Mine, just really pull apart my opponent's hand and disrupt their mana base and just play really aggressive 3-drops. You'll notice that I actually run very few 4-drops. This Spawn of Mayhem is technically a 4-drop. I'm running Caves of Chaos Adventurer because it's a very good initiative creature. I think most of the black initiative creatures kind of suck, honestly. They're not aggressive enough unless you've already gone into the Forge, and by the time you're in the Forge, you're already winning. So you really just want cards that are good enough on their own, and Caves fits that bill. And then Shielded obviously is... some people might say it's not good, but it's inevitability. You need it to be answered. Your opponent needs to answer it, or else it's going to take over the game. So this deck has a lot of 3-drops, and actually very few 2-drops. And so to facilitate that, obviously all the fast mana, I'm playing Crystal Vein, which is another piece of fast mana, and I'm even playing Peat Bog and Sandstone Needle. This is obviously going quite deep. The depletion lands are polarizing cards, to say the least. I won't call them bad because they have their place, but they definitely are a little awkward. But the nice thing about playing a depletion land in this deck is that if you start turn 1 depletion land into turn 2, untapped land, that casts a 3-drop. Then turn 2, you play another land and you cast a 4-drop or a 3-drop with your depletion land. And then you have only 2 lands left. Well, turn 4, you play your 3rd land, you play another 3-drop. So it really rolls into this idea of, I want to play a 3-drop every turn of the game, starting from turn 2 onwards. or possibly even earlier, because obviously that's what the Mana Crypt is for. Let's see, things that are in here. I've got, Ren's Resolve, Reckless Impulse, Flight of the Stage, Knight's Whisper, all for card advantage. You get things like Breaches and Florian and Lelia. For destructive pieces, I've got the Moons, I've got, heavy hand attack spells. There's not a lot of removal, you'll notice. It's Snuff Out, Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, Bitter Triumph, Shieldred's Edict. So that's what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's kind of like 8 removal spells. This End of Festivity is kind of like a 9th one. And then, your creatures can do a little bit. You've got Fury and stuff. But really, this deck is mostly focused on rip apart your opponent's hand with hand attack, land threat after threat after threat after threat. I won't call this optimized. Things that I think could be changed. Dark Confidant is really kind of cute. When it's good, it's really good, and when it's bad, it's pretty embarrassing. And it really does restrict things that you would want to put in the deck. So, for example, I think this deck could probably have used Troll of Khazad-dûm and Oliphant, which are the LTR cyclers. LTR cycling. It really could have used Oliphant and Troll of Khazad-dûm, because those are ways to fix your mana in a deck that's honestly got pretty horrendous mana, especially because you definitely want your basics to upgrade under your Blood Moons. And you don't really want to run 6 drops with Dark Confidant. That's just not really very viable. Other things I could have had a Spitting Dilophosaurus in here. Honestly, you can change up the threat suite as you desire. Things like End the Festivities don't need to be in here. That was because I put that in there because I was facing a lot of X1 decks with things like Death and Taxes. I played against a few Grists, which really gummed up the board. But, these types of cards are all flexible. I think that the main issue with this deck, I still think it's okay, but I think this deck did not do as well as I would have hoped, because it really has a lot of 3-drops, and the 3-drops, the first, 10 3-drops are quite good. The second 10 3-drops, less good. But going up to 4, I think you can play more 4-drops, but I think that it is still difficult. And I think what I need to do was sort of fine-tune the numbers on the creatures, the mana base, what mana sync should be in here, stuff like that. But, here's an example of a deck that is still very aggressive, but it takes a little bit of a step back from stuff like Medium Red to play these really disruptive pieces. Okay, so that was Black-Red monsters. The next one is Green-White monsters. I have played this deck in the past. In the past, I originally did Mox Emerald, Mox Pearl, Soul Ring, because that was before Strip Mine went to 2, so I couldn't play this spread. And I think the deck works fine either way. What I've done with this version is I'm splashing black. The black cards I'm splashing are Grist, Orchestra Masters, and Op Agent. And I'm also splashing Dismember, sort of, because it's technically a colorless spell, and Fatal Push. I'm playing, all the usual mana dorks, Generous Ent, Timeless Dragon, as ways to get more mana. I'm playing Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth. I'm playing 34 lands. I went down on lands because you have so many mana dorks, you have so much mana in the deck, you're probably okay on lands. This is what the curve looks like. As you can see, I've got 3 5-drops, but Timeless Dragon, again, doesn't really count as a 5-drop because it's a plain cycler for 2, and then it's a 4-drop for the Eternalize. Triumph of St. Catherine is a 5-drop, but sometimes it'll be a 2-drop, so really my only 5-drop is Thrun. I think that's being conservative like that is reasonable. The entire purpose of this deck was to use mana dorks and fast mana to break parity on some taxation effects like Thorn of Amethyst and Winter Orb, and obviously play a lot of hate bears. So things like Archon of Emeria, Aethers-Sworn Canonist, Thalia, Little Thalia, Phyrexian Censor. In a deck that has huge haymakers, you don't you're not so worried about playing one spell a turn because your one spell a turn is usually more impactful than your opponent's. And I had a little bit of an anti-search theme going on with Leonin Arbiter, even Mind Sensor, and obviously the Op Agent that I'm splashing for. You don't usually see these two cards. You don't really see even Mind Sensor very much anymore anywhere, and you usually only see Leonin Arbiter in mono white. But the way that this deck works, also I was playing Yasharn, which is maybe a little cute. It really lets you lean on the strength of Strip Mine and Wasteland and play like Field of Ruin as if it was another Wasteland effect. Things that were in this deck that were cute. I was testing Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace was probably... It's not that Rest in Peace is a bad card, because it fits into that disruptive realm. It's that it's a meta dependent card. If there are a lot of blue decks and combo decks running around, especially graveyard combo decks, almost all combo decks use the graveyard, but there are some that don't. Rest in Peace is a huge haymaker that's much, much stronger than something like a Scavenging Ooze would be, or a Lion Sash. Unfortunately, when I was testing this, it turns out everybody decided to play fair creature decks, and so Rest in Peace was kind of a dead card that entire time. Things to take away. Your slots on where your 3s and 4s are can change quite a bit. I think Gilwain is an insane card. It's really good. But I think something like Thrun the Last Troll is really not so good. It's mostly for the blue matchup. So if you don't expect to see a lot of blue, probably don't play Thrun. Yasharn, I was testing this out as part of the anti-search thing. I don't think its abilities were relevant ever. It just comes down a little too late. So, that's a type of card that is worth investigating in terms of, maybe this should be another 3-drop like Tireless Tracker so that I can play things like, I can get the clue value to have more things to draw more cards. Something you might notice is that I'm not playing Collector Oof in this green deck. That's because I want to be able to use maps from Sentinel, Food from Treebeard, who's also like maybe a little bit of a dubious card, but I was testing him. Things like Tireless Tracker. You want to be able to use your Shadow Spear. I wasn't on Skull Clamp in this build, but Skull Clamp would probably have been a good fit for this build. Really this is a case study of I'm still aggressive, but instead of having everything be pure aggression in terms of the creature suite, a lot of the creatures are actually aimed at disruption. So a ton of hate bear effects that change the game in some meaningful way. Things that I think really could have been improved. This splashing for Dismember and Fatal Push. I'm not sure what the best solution is, but I don't think that splashing for Dismember and Fatal Push was the right idea. As I said in sort of in the slides, you really want to be splashing your cards higher on the curve, not for removal, for example. I also think Legolas's Quick Reflexes is not a very good card. This might be a little shocking because it reads as an insane card, but it just doesn't do the things you want it to do at the times you want them to do it. When you want to have a removal spell, your creature needs to be bigger. Okay, so if your creature is bigger, then you no longer have a protection spell when you use this as a removal spell. If you want to hold it as a protection spell, but there's something to remove, well, then you can't use it to remove the thing because you need to hold it as a protection spell. It's a little awkward. I think it's probably still worth playing, but I think it's one of those weird flex slots that should be looked at. Other things, this whole Arbiter, even Mind Sensor thing, it's possible that these, although they're really disruptive, should just be turned into more pressure. But this is sort of an example of building a more aggressive base, but focused on the disruptive creatures, using the green shell. Alright, that was green-white monsters. And finally we come to green-black lands midrange. I've said in the past that lands midrange is kind of dead, and I think it kind of is because it's dead in the traditional sense because what people like to do is they like to play things like Titania and Primeval Titan, and they go really high on the curve. And the good cards in the lands decks are the ones that are the 3 drops that you can accelerate into very easily, um, and that give you value that are just more high roll value. When you play cards that are really high on the curve, it's just unlikely that you get to them in the time that a modern Highlander game usually takes. So the main inspiration for this deck was actually sort of legacy lands decks that were playing things like Sphere of Resistance or Thorn of Amethyst. And I was watching some vintage decks, and I saw, oh, okay, I see spheres and thorns and trinispheres and all this stuff, and I thought, well, when you've got a ton of mana from Mana Dorks, plus a lot of fast mana, you can naturally break the parity on all these different disruptive effects. You're naturally insulated because you have more mana than most people. So you'd rather play these cards. This deck has 36 lands, plus 4 artifacts that make mana, plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 more mana dorks. So that's 8, 12, 48 mana sources. And we can get technical about things like this fast spawn count, etc. But the point is that this is a lot of mana. And that means that you naturally are going to be able to play through these taxation effects a lot better. The reason for the lands part, as opposed to just plain generic pressure, is that when you have taxation effects like Thorn of Amethyst, Sphere of Resistance, Trinisphere, taking out your opponent's mana sources is really powerful and can actually lock them under those pieces. Now again, the goal is not lock them under the pieces no matter what and then win. The goal is make them stumble really hard while beating them to death with creatures. So the land stuff is sort of a secondary effect that happens to dovetail nicely with these taxation plan, but it is not the main game plan. Really the lands pieces that I have included are Elvish Reclaimer as a tutor, Courser Prefix as card advantage, Aranus as a way to spend 0 mana to rebuy lands. Stuff like Life from the Loam is fine, and I am playing Life from the Loam, but it is mana intensive. Knight of the Reliquary, I am splashing white. I'm playing Knight of the Reliquary. Ramming Up Excavator is, again, sort of card advantage and high roll potential. Tireless Tracker is card advantage. Life from the Loam, I'm not playing a lot of, and Fast Bond. I'm not as deep as things like Zernord or Titania or Primeval Titan. It's not really meant to be a combo deck. It's meant to be a mid-range deck. What I have done is I have splashed white in this deck for the Knight of Reliquary, White Plume Adventurer, and Seasoned Engineer. And this turned out to be quite powerful. White Plume and Seasoned Engineer are really strong snowbally threats that happen to work really well underneath, taxation effects. I think it is not unreasonable if someone else wanted to try this deck, if you wanted to try this deck yourself, to, instead of splashing white, to splash red, because you get access to Ren and 6, Minsc and Boo, and then probably I'd splash something like Moloch, maybe even Miglaws. But, the white splash is also quite good. I think that is worth splashing in this 2-color deck, because the mana base can support it, the mana dorks can support it. This still has the same amount of pressure with things like Dread Fugue, Duress, Inquisition. Mind Twist is another one of those things that, if you Mind Twist somebody for 4 on turn 3 or whatever, it's really good. I actually did that to my Death and Taxes opponent, and they did not have a good time. Things that are in this deck that could be improved. I think, again, I could have looked at things like the Lord of the Rings Cyclers, Generous Ent, Troll of Khazad-dûm. I think that the deck maybe didn't need something like Lodestone Golem and could have just used more generic 4 or 3 drops. And the issue with decks like this is that you're spending a lot of slots in terms of proactively going fast and also supporting whatever theme you want. So what really suffers is your removal. I really only have Snuff Out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 removal spells plus Grist. costs like Grist, and you can maybe count this Spinning Dilophosaurus thing. It's really like maybe 6 removal spells in the entire deck, which is not a lot. You don't want to be overly bloated on removal spells, but if you're planning to take this to a meta with a lot of fair creature decks, maybe you want to up those counts. Maybe you want to take out your Thorn of Amethyst and your Winter Orb for more removal. Yeah, I actually think that this deck turned out quite well. I think one of the pitfalls that you can run into when trying to support a theme like a lands theme is running too many cards that are too cute. So things like Lotus Cobra or Tireless Provisioner were in early builds of this, and they were just really, really bad. They're really good when you're comboing and doing the thing, but if you're already doing the thing, you're winning. Yeah, so this is sort of the furthest end of what I've tested in terms of moving away from pure aggression towards more of a disruptive lock piece type deck. So yeah, I mean, and this can be in a lot of different color combinations. I chose green-black because I like the disruption that black gives. I like the hand attack. I like the natural graveyard hate that you get, the anti-search. You get some nice hate bears out of black. But you could have easily have made this green-red or green-white. Yeah. So I guess my point is to finish up this presentation. My point is that the Crypt mock strip spread is really quite flexible, and there's a lot you can do with it. And I'm pretty convinced that you can do almost any 2-color combination. Obviously, you can do monocolor as well. You can do almost any monocolor 2-color combination with this spread, and it's quite powerful. And I think it's actually one of the more... It's both powerful and one of the more interesting spreads to be playable since the most recent points change. It's not all fast mana, but it is explosive and disruptive, and so it kind of fits this sort of interesting niche that some of the other point spreads don't. So that's all I had to say about that. Hope that you enjoyed watching, that you enjoyed my rambling about fast mana and Canadian Highlander, and that maybe this inspired some people to, try their own brews, try their own stuff. If you have any comments or questions, you want to talk theory, feel free to comment on the video or to tag me on the Discord at Cyclops8. Other than that, thank you for watching and have a great day. See you next time.